All right, welcome everyone. Just waiting a few minutes here to see who else pops in the room. I see the numbers are still going up, so I give people just a few more minutes to pop in. But welcome, welcome, welcome. Nice to have you on a Saturday afternoon. I think the numbers are starting to slow down here. So I think we can go ahead and get started. Okay, hey everybody, welcome. Bee enthusiasts, one and all. This is Applied Ecology's first, hopefully annual, Bee Hotel Build Along. And I'm Michelle Jewell. I'm the science communicator for the Department of Applied Ecology. You've probably seen me on some of the other events that we've had if you've joined in, like the Fermentology series or our striped bass live dissection that we just had. And I'll be the master of our ceremonies this afternoon. And as you can see, I'm joined by two other people in the room here. And I'll start by introducing Elsa. Dr. Elsa Youngsteadt is an entomologist, and she's an assistant professor also here in the Department of Applied Ecology. Elsa's lab looks at the urbanization and climate change effects on insects, including bees and ants. And we're going to be focusing, of course, on bees today. She's also co-authored a free bee ID guide for native bees. I'm going to go ahead and throw that link in the chat as well. It's a free PDF, but there is a print version that you can purchase, which I think it's like $14 or something like that, also maybe 15. And so Elsa's going to be taking us through all the bee information and bee ecology that we'd like to know about our native bees in our garden. And then we'll be passing it off to Ian Boyd. Ian is a library specialist with NC State's Libraries, where he works in the Learning Spaces and Services Department. And as a member of the Makerspace team, Ian leads workshops in 3D design, 3D printing, and digital modeling, which is all just, it sounds like incredible wizardry to me, to be honest. The NC State University Library's Makerspace program is broadly accessible, it's an interdisciplinary program, and it supports making and learning campus-wide. And their services include technical consultation, workshops, and again, 3D printing, which I'm sure you'll get on the bone with Alan there. So let me explain a little bit about how this is going to work. We're going to first start off with Elsa. She's going to be explaining to us about the bees in our neighborhood. You will probably have questions during Elsa's talk. And the way that you can send in your questions is using the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen there. So if you see the little box that says Q&A, you'll click on that and throw your question into there. And I'll be asking those questions live to Elsa as you have them. So at any point, if you want to ask a question, throw it in that box. And then after Elsa's presentation, we'll pause for a few more questions, and then we'll transition over to the build along with Ian. And we'll give you a little bit of time to take a little bit of break, maybe a bio break, get your materials together, and then we'll start the build with Ian. All right, without any further ado, I will pass things over to Elsa.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Michelle, for getting the ball rolling and for having the brilliant idea to get us all together to build bee hotels this afternoon. So I am going to share my screen. All right. So like Michelle said, before we actually get into the build, I want to give us some context and some sort of best management practices so you have a good sense of what this bee hotel actually is, what function it's serving in your landscape, and how to take care of it and keep everyone healthy who's living inside. We'll start with the very basics. What is a bee hotel? I imagine that if you're here, you have some sense of that already, but they come in a huge variety of shapes and sizes, like as shown in this picture. But really, at their essence, they're all nest boxes for bees. They're essentially like a birdhouse, except they're for bees. And they all contain nesting tunnels that simulate a habitat that can go missing in areas where a lot of people sort of are living and managing the landscape. They simulate what bees would normally use, which is like beetle drilled holes in dead wood, or hollow pithy twigs and stems that are, dead bits of plants. So when those habitat elements are missing, we can recreate them by installing a bee hotel. So it can provide habitat in agricultural settings. Artificial nesting boxes are used to actually augment pollination in agricultural habitats, and they probably serve the same function for home gardens. They can also just be fun to watch, as you can get up close and see your residents coming and going and constructing their nests. And they're also an important research tool. We use them in our ecology research here at NC State. Many biologists all over the world do. And if you're interested, there are even citizen science projects, not based here, but various ones around the world that collect data from anybody who has a bee hotel. So you can actually contribute your observations to a broader information gathering process. So that's the very basic of what a bee hotel is. And now let's look at kind of how it fits into the broader ecology and life cycle of bees here in North Carolina. So in our state, we have about 560 species of bees, the vast majority of which are native and wild, not managed like honeybees. The bees in these pictures are just a few examples. And so you see they range from tiny, just a few millimeters long little bees that nest in the ground, to our giant carpenter bees, to bumblebees, and so on. So of those 560 species, who would actually use a bee hotel? It's actually a fairly small slice of that diversity. We'll come back to that. So despite all of the diversity of these 560 species of bees in terms of shapes and sizes, they do have some life cycle elements that they all share in common that kind of unites them as bees. And we'll start the life cycle with what we normally see when we're out in a garden or a meadow and we see bees foraging. This is kind of what comes to mind, is the adult bee on a flower. And the bees on flowers, if they're female bees, are usually collecting nectar and pollen to take back to a nest. Most of it's not for their own personal consumption. And if you're lucky, you might actually see an adult bee foraging, taking materials into her nest. In this case, this is a leaf cutting bee who's taking some construction materials into her nest as well. And once she gets that nest nicely set up, lined with leaves and loaded with nectar and pollen, she'll lay an egg on that pollen provision. And then she'll build a wall so that an egg lives in just kind of a private chamber that the bee that hatches from that egg will never meet its mother. When it hatches, it will eat the pollen that the mom has left there for it. It will complete development into a pupa, which is kind of a transitional phase. It doesn't eat, it's just transitioning from being a larva to being an adult. And then finally, the adult bee will emerge and start the cycle over again. Depending on the species, that can take anywhere from about a month to a whole year to complete. But regardless of the bee, there are a couple of major requirements that they need in order to be able to complete that life cycle successfully. One big one, of course, is food, that pollen and nectar that the mom bee needs to stock the nest and feed her larvae. There's a lot of resources out there on pollinator gardening, on providing food for bees, so we're not getting into that today at all. Today, we're concerned with the shelter side of the story. And you'll notice here in my shelter picture, I'm actually showing the ground, not a bee hotel. And there's a reason for that. Out of our 560 species of bees in North Carolina, more than 3/4 of them actually nest in the ground. Most of them dig their own little nesting tunnels into the ground. And these bees wouldn't even consider a bee hotel as potential real estate. There's also a handful of bees who nest in other sorts of kind of random cavities, old rodent burrows, bird nests that aren't in use, crevices in stone walls, or other kinds of voids. Those are also not your typical bee hotel residents. It's that 21% that's remaining, maybe 100 or so species in North Carolina that normally nest in beetle holes in dead wood or in hollow pithy stems. And these are the bees that might consider occupying your bee hotel. And so what actually goes on inside that tunnel? Mostly we only ever see the bee coming and going out of the entrance, and we don't really get to see what goes on inside. And so if you were to take a cross section of a nest, this is a nest inside of a hollow reed. The mom bee goes back to the back, builds a partition, in this case out of chewed up leaf material to kind of put a nice back on her nest. She maybe builds a couple of those and then starts loading in the pollen, lays an egg on that. And then she'll continue filling the nest so that by the time she's done with it, you have several different chambers, each with its own developing offspring. And The ones in the back develop faster. So you see we've got a cocoon back here that contains a pupa, like I mentioned. And then some of these bigger larvae are about to polish off their pollen. And then up in the front, there's still one last nest in progress. So this is what you might find if you actually split open a nest. And I want to take a look at what that really looks like. I'm going to play a video and have my fingers crossed that it works for everyone. And so this is video taken not by me. This is on the internet, but it's one of my favorite videos of bees because we really get to peer into their kind of personal life inside this nest. So this is a red mason bee. It's a European species, and it's being filmed through a plexiglass nest sidewall. And so she's just gotten back with a load of nectar and pollen. So you saw her, she had regurgitated the nectar and was working it into the pollen to make that little loaf. Now she's turned around and she's cleaning off all the pollen that she collected while she was out. And that'll take her a little while to get finished. And then once she's done, she's gonna head out and get another load. And depending on the species, bees can take anywhere, up to 50 trips to get enough pollen to feed one single larva. And then another 20 trips or so to, this is the awkwardness with my PowerPoint. Here we go. And another 20 trips or so to actually complete the nest walls in between those different chambers. So it's a lot of work to make a bee nest. So that should give you a sense of some of the context of which kinds of bees are going to use a bee hotel and what they're doing in there. I want to take a few minutes to look at some of the more specific residents, some of the most common residents that might occupy your bee hotel here in North Carolina. And some of the most sought after residents are mason bees. These are bees in the genus Osmia, and they contain probably the most famous bee hotel resident, which is the blue orchard bee, which is actually reared commercially as an orchard pollinator. So orchard growers can hire somebody to bring in thousands of cocoons, and those bees will hatch and pollinate or emerge and then pollinate the orchard more efficiently even than honeybees would. They're also good backyard neighbors. But they're certainly not the only mason bee out here. We have 21 additional species of mason bees in North Carolina who are also native, often smaller than the blue orchard bee. So among these 22 species, mason bees will use nests that are anywhere from about 3 to 13 millimeters in diameter, or just over 1/8 of an inch to about 1/2 an inch. And this is what the interior of a mason bee nest might look like. The bee that we just watched on the video was a mason bee. This one builds slightly differently. She uses leaf instead of mud as a construction material. But those are the two main things they'll use, is mud or chewed up leaf pulp. And across these 22 species, they'll forage on a variety of plants. They certainly, the blue orchard bees have a strong preference for spring fruit trees. You also see them on red buds a lot. The other species linger later into the spring. You'll see them on clover and other plants. So that's one group to look out for. Another one is the leaf cutting bees, which are members of the genus Megabee. They're active a little later in the year than the mason bees. They start around May, and you can see them up until first frost in October or November. We have about 37 different species of Megabee in North Carolina. Probably the most famous one is actually introduced, the alfalfa leaf cutting bee. It's one that we know a lot about their biology, again, because they're reared commercially and used in agriculture as a pollinator for canola and for alfalfa. That's actually an introduced species, but we have 36 others, most of which are native to North Carolina, and many of which would nest in a bee hotel. Some also nest in the ground. And like Osmia, they'll use a range of hole sizes from about a little over 1/8 of an inch to almost 1/2 an inch. And they'll also be looking for other construction materials in the landscape to complete the nest interior. And different species use different things. They might use pieces of leaf or flower petal. They might chew up leaf pulp like some of the mason bees do. They might collect mud, sand, or resin to complete their nest interiors. This picture shows one that's been made with leaf pieces. And they're often generalist foragers. They'll visit a variety of plants. I see them pollinating cucumbers in my garden, for example. And this is a sign to look out for in your landscape. If you have Megabee, many of the species will cut these neat sort of semicircles out of the edges of leaves. That's them collecting the nesting materials to line their nest with. if you took the whole nest like out of the bee hotel, it would kind of look like this little leaf burrito. So it's important that they be able to find these kind of nesting materials in the landscape, and also that you recognize it for what it is and don't feel like you have some terrible pest. They rarely really do that much damage to a plant, although this little sapling's looking pretty rough. So there are a variety of plants they use. None of them are 100% picky, but some common ones that they like to cut leaf bits for their nests are from roses, redbuds, grapes, greenbrier. Who wants greenbrier? But these bees like it. Buckwheat, honeysuckle. Those are all options that you might consider having in your landscape to facilitate nesting in a bee hotel. Finally, it's not all bees all the time, and that's not a bad thing. You'll also see some solitary wasps nesting in your bee hotel. And these are much more mild-mannered wasps than you might think of if you're thinking of paper wasps or yellow jackets that you really feel like they're out to get you. These are all solitary wasps. They don't have a colony to defend. They're really kind of minding their own business, and they can be just as much fun to watch as bees. And most of the time, they are hunting caterpillars or crickets to feed to their larvae. So they can actually do some kind of pest control in your garden if you have a caterpillar problem, for example. So some common ones you'll see are mason wasps. This is one common example. And if you split open their nests, you see it's a similar structure with little mud partitions. And then these fat little larvae in here are nearly ready to pupate wasp larvae who've already eaten all their caterpillars. This is another one you're likely to see. This is a grass-carrying wasp, and you'll recognize their nest because they have all these pieces of grass sticking out the entrance. And the inside, you see the grass is packed into these tighter plugs, which protects the larvae, which are eating crickets. So those are a few of the residents you're likely to see. And now I want to get into kind of some of the nitty-gritty of how you're going to put this bee hotel in your landscape, how you're going to take care of it. And this is where I might get into some details that make this sound more burdensome than fun. I promise that's not the case. And Michelle, if you can actually stick that link in the chat at this point, you don't have to worry about taking notes on some of these details that I'm going to share, because I've also been working on a document that spells out some of these considerations in more detail than I'm even going to now. The document that Michelle is sharing is absolutely a draft version. I'm sharing it with you all early because you're here. So it's still a work in progress. You're probably going to find typos, but hopefully it'll be helpful to keep some of these considerations in mind as you continue to manage your bee hotel. So the first thing to think about is the nesting materials that you're going to put inside. Today you're going to build a lovely shelter, but you need to put nest tunnels inside of it. And so the key characteristics for nesting tunnels are that they be breathable, that they have an open front but a solid back. You don't want a tunnel that just runs all the way through with no like back wall. You're going to want to clean or retire them every 2 or 3 years, and we'll talk more about how that actually works. And you can purchase nesting materials from commercial suppliers, or you can make them yourself, or you can go forage for them, in your garden. So there's a few options. One thing you can do is the drilled block style, that you can use pieces of untreated lumber or natural branches like this and just drill nesting tunnels in them. There's also the grooved board option. Once these are stacked together, the grooves line up to make little nesting tunnels, and these are easier to clean out in the winter compared to just the straight drilled boards. Or you can use natural stems that you collect or that you purchase. These hollow reeds are a popular option. They're all cut at a node, so the back is solid, but the front is open. It may be tempting to use drinking straws, paper or plastic, but this is not recommended. They seem like they're about the right size, about the right length, but plastic straws don't breathe, and you usually get like close to 100% mortality from mold if you use plastic straws as nesting materials, and paper is so thin that parasites can very easily lay their eggs through it and get all your bees. So no straws. So besides the type of nesting material, the diameters are also important. That's my 17-minute warning. My clock just went off. So diameter is also important. Like I said, the range of sizes that residents might use are anywhere from 2 millimeters in diameter up to 12.7, or I guess I should say inches, anything from 5/64 of an inch to half an inch will be used by someone. And the reason the diameter matters and why I recommend having a variety of diameters is because different species use different diameters. So you'll support greater diversity if you have a range of sizes. And each species kind of has an optimum size that even if they're squeezing into a nest that's a little bit too small, they won't produce as many offspring. They won't produce as many female offspring. If the nest is too big for them, they have to do a lot of remodeling inside to try and make it fit. And that's a waste of energy. The length also matters. A length of about 3 to 8 inches for your tunnel is recommended, and that's what'll fit nicely in the shelter that you're going to build today. Length matters for similar reasons. Different species prefer different lengths. They also almost always put their female offspring in the back, and then there's a male zone in the front of the nest. And if the male zone takes up too much of the nest, you won't ever get any female offspring, and the next generation will have trouble, pairing up. You also, of course, need your tunnels to be in some kind of shelter. That's what you're building today. This shelter illustrates some kind of good characteristics that yours also does. It has a nice overhang to protect from rain. It has also a variety of nesting materials and textures in it. That variety actually helps individual bees recognize their own address when they're returning from a foraging trip. Like maybe they flew down the block and they've still got to find their 1/4 inch of real estate here. And having a variety of sort of shapes and textures helps them to do that. Another way of getting that sort of variety nest finding cues is actually by painting your hotel or the fronts of the nesting blocks. That's what's been done here in this gigantic alfalfa leaf cutting bee operation. Bees see in color, they see blue, white, and yellow particularly well, which is why these are painted in those colors. And those are colors you might consider if you want to paint your shelter as well. In both cases, these hotels or these nesting structures are attached to larger buildings. That helps make a bigger landmark, and that helps the returning bee find her apartment building on her way back from a foraging trip, even before she zeroes in on a specific nest. It's common practice to aim your nest entrances southeast. So bees get morning sun, get warmed up and start early, and then don't bake in the afternoon sun. And usually they're put about 4 or 5 feet above the ground just for convenient maintenance. So speaking of maintenance, I mentioned that you need to clean or retire your nesting materials every 2 or 3 years, but they have to be empty before you clean them. And there's always bees or wasps inside. So how do you actually go about this? There is a trick. So in the winter, if your materials have been in use for 2 or 3 years, it's time to retire them or clean them. So you're going to take them out of your shelter and put them in an emergence box, which is any kind of wooden box that has just one bee-sized hole in it. So you're going to take your nesting blocks or tubes, put them in this box. You're going to do that in sort of late spring, early winter. Late winter, early spring, sorry. And in the early spring, you'll set this box outside. The bees will start emerging. They'll see the light through this one little hole. They'll fly out, but this is no longer an attractive thing for them to come back into. So in the meantime, you've hopefully stocked your shelter with fresh nesting materials. They'll find those, and that will continue throughout the spring, summer, and fall, depending on the species. And by that fall, then those materials that you stuck in the emergence box will be empty, and you can, if it's just natural stems and reeds, you can throw them in the compost or on the forest floor. If it's grooved boards or drilled blocks, you can bleach those and let them dry out before you reuse them. And then finally, we've talked a lot about the nesting materials. Of course, like we said, all bees need food and shelter. So a nest alone does not a good landscape make. So the ideal landscape includes not only nesting tunnels, but also those construction materials, sources of leaves and mud or flower petals that they use to build the nest interior, as well as, of course, pollen and nectar for the offspring. And it's important to keep that in mind because some of these smaller wild bees can fly as little as 1/10 or 1/4 of a mile from their nest. And then they come back to their nest after every trip, and there can be hundreds of trips. So the closer their resources are together, the more efficient things are for them, the better they can do at actually, providing for their offspring and keeping their nests safe. So that concludes my rearing tips. I'm gonna unshare my screen and quickly point out a couple of things about the bee hotel that you're gonna make today, which this is my version of a very similar design. I've painted mine white, but I wanna point out a couple of things. Like, first of all, we've got a nice couple-inch roof overhang here, so that should keep your nest safe from rain. And so that's why you don't want nests that are going to stick out very far beyond the front, because they want to need to be tucked in and sheltered. There's 2 different cubbies, so there's room to stick different kinds of nesting materials. This one contains, I've put in some grooved boards. These are the ones that I showed a picture of, and they unstack like this. So once you've put them in your emergence box and everybody's out, they're very easy to clean. I've also got some purchased reeds that you can get on the internet. They're very popular with our bees around here in Raleigh. And then I've also got a few sort of foraged pithy stems. So blackberry, or thornless blackberry is a very popular one. Sunflower stems are also good. As you cut them, make sure you're getting rid of splinters off the front. And they'll all have pith in them. You can either leave the pith in, some species will clean it out, or you can ream it for them. If you ream it, just leave a little plug in the back so you've still got that solid back wall. This hotel is also flat on the back, so you can mount it flush against, say, a shed or an outbuilding, something that does make a larger landmark for your foraging bees. And I haven't put my mounting hardware on yet, but I'm going to use this birdhouse mounting bracket, which comes apart like this. So this part will go on the shed, this part will go on the bee hotel, and it'll just slot in like that. So I think those are the high points I wanted to mention about this particular design that you're gonna make. Last one, it's not too big. You may see ones that are like shed sized. And I actually don't recommend going over about 100 nesting tunnels in a single structure. We don't know a ton about every species preferences, but at least for blue orchard bees, they seem to start feeling uncomfortable and they don't want to nest in a block that has more than about 100 holes in it. Plus, it just makes it easier to maintain and take care of. So those are my intros to the bees and the structure. And are there questions that we should take before we transition over to the build?
Thank you, Elsa. Yes, I have tons of questions, and I'm going to ask this one first. I have this question, Carrie has it, Kenneth has asked it as well. So if the bees in the back are growing up first, and the back is solid, is what we want, how do those mature, how do they get out without disturbing the rest of the bees?
Yeah, great question. So there's a little bit of magic that happens in there. So there's 2 things that seem to happen. Like, first of all, the bees in the back are the females and the bees in the front are the males. Males are smaller, so they develop faster. So even though they get started later, they are the ones who are ready first, and they usually come out first. So that helps, just because they're smaller, they get to the finish line faster with their development. But there's also a possibility that some of the bees in the back get also a little bit oxygen deprived, because it's way back there and there's like all those partitions between them and the entrance. And so it's that may slow them down a little bit too and even things up. So in the end, they don't end up piling all over each other on their way out. It ends up pretty orderly.
Of course, they figured it out by now. I've got tons more. There was another one that I wanted to get to first. Oh, Lori was curious, do the same adult bees come back to the same nest box over and over again?
Yeah, so an individual adult bee usually lives just, maybe a month, a few months, and it'll often use multiple tunnels in the same nest box. But then bees also tend to return to the same nest box where they emerged. So your population will tend to accumulate in your nesting box over years, because the same bees that are produced from that nesting box will come back to it to nest, to make their nest. Great.
And another quick question about, this is going into materials now. if you forage for sticks, like you were saying about the hollow sticks, how would you go about plugging the ends of some of them?
So yeah, that's a great question. And what I look for ones that already have like a solid pithy center. So like I can't hold this up and look through it. It's already got pith in it. So you could just leave it there, and some bees, like small carpenter bees, will hollow out the pith themselves. There are a few leaf cutting bees who will do that and incorporate the pith kind of into their nest walls. Or you can take like a little threaded rod or even a drill bit and pull out the pith, and that'll make it more appealing to some other species who don't want to go through that work, but just leave some in the back so that there is a back wall. If you had ones that were hollow clear through to begin with, I would probably stick like a little cork or something in the back. Like the reason it's more attractive to bees to have a solid back wall, and it helps protect them from parasites that then, they have fewer places to enter the nest from. So those would be my recommendations for keeping a solid back. And then if you're using grooved boards, which are usually, grooved the whole length, like what do you do there? Those you just make sure that they're like pushed very snugly up against the back wall of the hotel, so that then creates the back for those.
So something like a trimmed down wine cork, maybe.
Yeah, or just a little teeny, like you can get teeny corks at craft stores or hardware stores. Right.
So what I'm hearing you saying is we need to drink more wine for bee conservation in our
Yeah, sure. That's solid logic.
Okay. Fantastic. That's the takeaway, folks. A few more questions about the material itself. You showed yours had paint on it.
Yep.
Are there certain types of paints to avoid? Are all paints fair game?
From the bees' perspective, I don't know. I would avoid red. They can't see the color red. That just looks black to them. And any darker colors, I would worry about it heating up the bee hotel too much, because afternoon sun, like the larvae are pretty heat sensitive. So you don't want it really cooking in there. As far as like high VOC, low VOC, I don't know. If it's been out there for a while, you're probably fine. I would just use something that's like exterior grade so that it'll last.
It'll last, yeah. Okay. And then some questions here for some of the folks who, not everybody's got a kit to build with us today. So a lot of questions coming in about if people wanted to go out and buy a bee hotel in the store. Let me find the person who said that, they've noticed that some of those store-bought ones, Christine's got this, that some of the store-bought ones can have a lot of plastic parts to them. And that's something that we should be avoiding, right? If we're going to go and buy a bee hotel?
I would definitely avoid plastic for any of the nest tunnels themselves. It's pretty common for like when people are doing research bee hotels that don't need to look like a pretty part of the landscape, it's really common to use like a PVC pipe as the shelter, and then stick your tunnels inside that pipe. And that seems to be fine. Like the outer shelter can be a little less breathable as long as your nesting materials themselves are natural, like wood or stems. But I would definitely look for like some of the things you see in commercial bee hotels that are like not such great ideas. A lot of them contain like pine cones and moss. Those are never or almost never used by nesting bees and wasps. So if that's your target audience, I wouldn't bother with those materials. Some of them are very short from front to back, so you could only have nesting tunnels of a couple inches. That's not ideal. You want to be able to have a range of lengths up to maybe 6 or 8 inches. And there was one other thing I was going to say about them. Oh, some of them are stocked with bamboo nesting materials that are really big diameter, like over an inch. And those are mostly not going to attract any of the species that we talked about today that you usually want in your bee hotel. So those are things to look out for.
So bamboo's okay just as long as it's within those diameters that you were showing.
Yeah.
Us. Okay.
Yeah. Some people recommend against bamboo because like there's this whole other culture of bee hoteling where you're micromanaging much more if you target like one species. Like if you really want blue orchard bees or you really want alfalfa leaf cutting bees, and you'll put out all one diameter tunnel. And then at the end of their development, you'll split those tunnels open and you'll sort through them and get rid of anything that's not your species. And so if you want to do that, which some people do, and there's like cocoon buyback programs and all that.
Wow.
If you want to do that, then bamboo is terrible to split open. You can't really get into it and get your residents out. But if you want to have a little more hands-off approach and just kind of let them do their thing and then retire your nesting materials every couple of years, it's fine.
And one last question I'll get to here. There are tons more. I mean, folks, if I don't get to your question here, you can Elsa, if you don't mind, I can throw your email into the chats as well.
Yep, please, or yeah, send me the chat and we can like compile some
Perfect.
add them to that draft that we posted.
Perfect. And when it comes to the residents, right? And you mentioned that some of the solitary wasps will come in, and that's a good thing. We want them in the gardens too. They're part of the biodiversity of a happy, healthy garden. But what about, let me find the question here so I can get the name correct. Megan was curious. She has wasps that do build nests in some of her buildings. When she's placing her bee hotel, should she keep it further away from those areas that are pretty waspy, or will they leave it alone, or what would you advise?
Good question. I don't feel like I've got a strong basis for an answer. Like the first thing I think of is like, well, those wasps probably know a good thing when they find it. Like maybe that's a good spot where there's like some nice morning sun and not too hot. So if they're like social wasps, like paper wasps that are going to come out and zap you while you're maintaining your bee hotel, like yeah, I would stay away from those. Like solitary dirt daubers, those kinds of like more mild-mannered wasps, then like those should be fine neighbors.
Nice. So right, I'll just have you reiterate. We had a few more questions about the same thing. When it comes to the materials themselves, so the things that we want the bees to be living in, you're advising don't use paper straws, don't use plastic straws, that corrugated cardboard, probably not a good idea.
No, not the greatest. Like those
Okay.
paper and cardboard are so, like it's very easy for parasitic wasps to just stick their little egg laying device right through there. And so, yeah, when we compare different materials, like even cardboard with like 100% losses of the bees inside, we raised all parasitic wasps and no bees. Some parasitic wasps was fine, but you don't really want 100% mortality. So it seems like the natural materials are safer.
I see. Okay.
And it's fine, like paper straws can be useful if you're using like drilled blocks that are kind of hard to clean. You can put paper liners in those tunnels to make it easier to like tidy up when it's time. You can pull those paper straws out and put them in your emergence box rather than putting the whole block in there. So that's certainly an option, but I wouldn't use paper as just a standalone material.
Right. Okay. All right, folks. So we're at 1:40 now. Let's get all of our materials together and we can meet back here, let's say at 1:50. That gives enough time for everybody to get your materials together in front of the computer. Maybe take a bio break, maybe grab another can of seltzer water. That's probably what I'm going to do. And then meet us back here at 1:50. Don't close the room. You can just leave it open. We'll be here and I'm just going to share that screen. I'm also going to put Elsa's information in the chat so that you have it. And there we go. There's Elsa's link in there. That's got her email, and anything else you want to know about her is there too. So yeah, let's meet back here in about 10 minutes. Does that sound good, folks? All right, I'll see you in 10 minutes.
So many good questions.